Welcome to Your Need to Know. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and today I'm talking with Delegate Marcus Simon from the 53rd House District here in Northern Virginia. Thank you so much for being here, Marcus.
Oh, happy to be here, Catherine. Thanks for having me.
Well, and we've spoken many times before on this show and outside this show, and I think the focus of today's show really is about helping people to understand how they can become engaged in public policy. And so let's start with how you got involved in state politics yourself. You were not, I imagine, as a toddler, having ambitions to be a House delegate.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's funny. I think probably until I was about 21 or 22, I knew I had a state representative, but didn't know who they were or what they did. But as it happened, my parents actually were more involved than I was, and they were very political, being here in the DC area, and they came to do public service. And my mom was on the government relations committee for the Fairfax Education Association, the teachers union, essentially. She was a teacher and politically involved. And she had just interviewed this brand new delegate, but a former supervisor named Jim Scott, who had run for office. And he won his election, as it turns out, by one vote.
That is a legendary story here in Northern Virginia, that Jim Scott won by one vote.
Yeah, landslide Jim. He took him a while to shake that moniker. But he had just barely won his election, had gone down to Richmond with the winter, not knowing if he was going to be seated or not when he got there in January. And then he came back from the spring looking for a legislative aide, because we delegates only get really one full-time staff person. So you want to pick them carefully. So he started reaching back out to some of the people he'd met during the campaign, saying, hey, if you know anybody who'd be a good fit. So it turns out my mom's like, wait, I know somebody. Yeah, I've got a kid who's about to graduate from college. This was 1992, and the economy was not great for folks graduating. So he's like, he's smart, he can write, he's a journalism minor, he's looking for a job, And Jim's like, well, the pay's pretty awful. She's like, that's fine.
Awful pay is better than zero pay.
Better than zero pay. So I ended up going to work for Jim, and it's interesting. It was a good fit for both of us. It gave me an opportunity to do some writing, and even though it wasn't journalism, which is what I thought I would do, there's a lot of letter writing, but press releases, speech writing, policy papers, things that you can do. So I could use my writing skills. And it was really good for him because he had somebody who'd grown up here in the community, knew the community, and wasn't afraid. One of the things journalism teaches you is how to talk to people. You have to do interviews, you have to call people, and sometimes you have reluctant sources, but you learn how to deal with all kinds of personality types. And that's a really important aspect of legislative aides jobs, so people that are looking to get in at that level. If you're able to talk to people, willing to talk to people, and you can write a little bit, that's about all you need to know. We can teach you everything else. And Jim did. He taught me everything else that I needed to know. And I went with him to Richmond the following January. I'd never been down for the General Assembly session. And I was just in awe of the process and how intimate it is, right? That individual folks can come in and see their delegates, knock on the door. There's a good chance you'll get in and poke your head in and be able to see them and talk to them. Much more accessible at that state level. And at the local level, as I find out later, working for Kate Hanley, that was my next job, then going to the big halls of Congress where everything's big and marble and imposing, and it seems like there are layers of staff between you and the member. It doesn't exist that way at the state and local level. So
and what I never assume that people understand, like, who their delegate is, or who their school board member is, or who their board of supervisors member is, although there are websites where you can put in your address and find out who represents you, right? But I think people also don't understand that we have a part-time legislature, a very part-time legislature, and that's not true in every state. That's true in Virginia.
Yeah, it's got its pros and its cons. I mean, I really like the idea that you've got folks from all parts of the community, different professions represented. You have lawyers, sure, you have doctors, though, you have pharmacists, you have nurses and physical therapists, you've got barbers, you've got undertakers. I mean, you name it, and we either have or have had. We have journalists, recovering journalists.
But they're citizen representatives.
Yeah, you have teachers. Our Speaker of the House was a longtime teacher, and our senior most member on the Democratic side, Ken Plum, was a teacher before they became legislators, and some while they were legislators.
But it's very compressed.
Yeah.
One year is 45 days. The other year it's 60 days, but you hear thousands of bills.
Yeah, so that's the downside, right? The nice side is we get a good cross-section of Virginia down there. The tough part is trying to get any real work done in 60 days. So it's sort of hard for new ideas to work their way through the system, certainly in one session. For instance, this year we had a bunch of folks came to, a number of us, looking to legalize sports gambling, right? Since the Supreme Court said states the federal government can't stop us from regulating sports gambling ourselves, and DC is starting to do it. Some folks say, well, why shouldn't Virginia get in on that? If it's going to happen across the river, why not you do it here? And so there are about 4 or 5 different bills, and it's just start essentially a new industry, right, in the state from scratch. Turned out to be a little more than we could handle in a 60-day session, and it's even more compressed than that, because we've got to each thing has to get through its House. What we call crossover, so the House has to finish its work to send things to the state Senate by the halfway point. So really a 60-day session is really more like a 30-day session, and that's just too big to tackle big issues in one year.
Which is why people need to be very patient, because some bills, some legislation takes years, and you just can't give up. You have to persist, and eventually there's a tipping point at which you get both sides and both parties to agree that it's a good piece of legislation that benefits everyone.
Yeah, I mean, we saw that with Medicaid expansion.
Yes.
It took some time, some persistence, and it also took a big wave election in 2017. So let's not forget the power of voters in all of this too.
Putting the right people in the seats, and also you have referenced, legislative agendas. The Fairfax Education Association certainly has one. Medicaid expansion was backed by chambers of commerce and hospitals when they decided that this was going to be part of their legislative agenda, which means we are proactively supporting passage of this.
Yeah, I mean, one of the first questions when we get a piece of legislation before us, well, who's for it and who's against it, right? Whose agenda is this on? Which groups are backing something like that? And so, which is, again, because we can't talk, although we try knocking on doors to talk to every single person, people that step forward, right? They're the ones that sort of the squeaky wheel, right? And there's so many ways to step forward, but one of the ways people step forward and make their voices heard is by joining their association, their professional association. So if you're, I met a constituent who's an optometrist and got involved in that heard their law. There's an association for optometry and ophthalmology, right? And eye care professionals, essentially. And she got on the Government Relations Council because she was unhappy with the way things were going, and said, well, how do I bring some common sense? How do I bring my expertise to folks? And so she joined the association, joined their lobbying arm, and first thing she did was, if I'm going to be doing this, I need to figure out who my legislator is.
Right.
And so she called, we had coffee. She's like, hey, I'm new to this and I want to get involved. And I thought probably the first thing I should do is look up my local delegate and, why haven't I met you yet? So, we went out and had coffee and I heard a lot about, eye care issues.
And so I want to keep track for our viewers at home of how you get involved. One way is that you get to know your delegate, you show up down in Richmond and knock on their door, you join your professional association and work on ideas for a legislative agenda that has a lot of power behind it. There's citizens that bring you an idea or a legislator an idea that ends up over a period of time getting a lot of traction. One that I was behind was a bill that would limit HOAs shutting down home-based childcare. And it took years and years to get that. Scott Serval on the Senate side, David Bulova on the House side.
Yep.
And David Bulova just happened to be on the Housing Commission, which helped enormously. But it's basically because child care providers in neighborhoods with HOAs were being shut down. Even though it was very ambiguous language, it was arbitrarily applied in different ways, and it wasn't specifically prohibited in the covenant. So this new law, which takes effect July 1, says HOAs can have a covenant, but it must be specific to child care homes if you're going to prohibit them.
Right. And so one of the things that made that more difficult, and this is sort of where you sometimes feel like you're on equal footing for a while, is the homeowners associations have had an organized lobby, right? And they have a lobbyist.
They have a lobbyist, yes,
right?
they do.
And she was actually the head of the board that was regulating them for a while, right? They're
Right.
lobbyists. So, and the child care providers didn't have that right away, right? So it took them a while to collectivize, right? To band together, to find each other, figure out that, hey, we're all experiencing the same problems, and how do we get together, and how do we work, as a group to balance out that influence. And so that's one of the things, is finding other people that have similar interests to yours, and working together with them, finding out if there's an existing organization that works on an issue that's similar to what you have. And so there's lots of ways, that's another way to do it, and to be persistent about it.
So let's talk a little bit about school funding, because not everybody knows what body, whether it's the state legislature, the board of supervisors, or their city council, or their school board, who gives out the money, how is it decided?
Right. So school funding, it's one of those issues that it's like, we call them kitchen table issues, or I call it, you pull out of your driveway issues, right? Things that affect your day-to-day life. Every time you leave your house, one of the first things many of us do, particularly if you have kids, is you drop them off at school or get them to the bus stop, make sure they're on their way. And then what happens when they get there? How many kids are there around? How big a classroom do they have? How new are their textbooks?
How long is their recess?
How long is their recess, right?
That's right.
Well, yeah, that's another great example, though, of a bill where some moms decided that their kids weren't getting enough recess and organized a movement, and we've got new, longer recess hours. But as far as the funding goes, that's one where it's easy for everybody to point fingers at somebody else because it is, a group effort. And so if you want to be concerned about that, you need to learn from the ground up. So you need to find out who your school board member is, right? I think my first stop would be at the school board and to say, hey, how are we allocating the resources? But the school board member is going to tell you, we don't have taxing authority in school boards in Virginia. We only get to divvy up the money. We don't get to decide how much there's going to be. We can decide how much to ask for, but the Board of Supervisors actually does the funding piece of it. So you need to, if you want more money in the pie, we cut the pie up, but if you want more money in the pie, you got to go to the Board of Supervisors. The Board of Supervisors will say, well, if we only could get some more money from Richmond, right?
They're the problem.
They're the real problem, that we fund much of it out of the property taxes, but there's only so much that homeowners are willing to bear, and if we only got more of our income tax dollars back from Richmond and circulated back to us for school funding, then we'd have more. So if you really are concerned about that, you need to learn who's your school board member, who's my supervisor, who's the chairman of the Board of Supervisors, who's my state delegate, who's my state senator. And then you might as well go ahead and get the governor too, right? While you're there.
But these are all local people. I mean, you live in the same community with your senator, your delegate, your school board member, and your board. So they're not far, far, far away, not like going to Washington, D.C. to Capitol Hill to find your representative.
Right, and they're folks that you can grab, and they're probably, again, this is what we talk about, the part-time. The Board of Supervisors is technically part-time too, although I think they're frankly a little more full-time than we are. They at least meet year-round, right? But you'll probably find folks that are similarly situated to you. Yes, when I hear about people talking about classrooms, I'm able to say, well, when I was first elected to office, my son was in 3rd grade with 31 other kids, right? So he was in a 32 child classroom with a teacher and an assistant and a part-time aide to manage all those kids. So you're going to probably get somebody who's empathetic, somebody who's been there and seen something like that. And so that's one of the things I love, frankly, about local government and getting involved is that it's very accessible. The people are just like you. One of the things I love to tell the 4th grade, I go to tell 4th graders about civics all the time. And I love the fact that I actually, part of my attendance area is the same. My kids go to the same elementary school I went to. So I'm able to go to their school and tell them, I was you. I was sitting in one of those seats, and my dad wasn't an elected official. My mom wasn't. I ran for office, and which means any of you all sitting there can too. It's, you need to know, though, the first step is you need to know who to complain to. It doesn't do a lot of good to complain to the other folks at the bus stop, and you can grouse to each other, but it's more productive if you can, direct your concerns to people that have the ability to change it.
And when we come back from this break, we're going to remind people of the importance of the fact that all of those offices that Delegate Simon just talked about are up for election this year in 2019. So please join us after the break.
Operation Wonder Park is a go!
There's nothing more powerful than imagination. But don't just imagine. Use STEM to change the world.
Who's with me?
Oh, it's gonna hurt tomorrow.
If she can STEM, so can you. Find out more at She Can STEM.
Maria, so how's work?
It was 4th period biology. Our students just weren't getting how easily viruses spread. So Miss Bell and I had them role play a zombie virus outbreak. By the time they had all learned the lesson, all the living were dead. Hey, how's your job going?
That big sales meeting I planned? Next year, I might get to go.
Cool.
I surrender.
All right, pal. Get ready for the day, buddy.
Hey, Dad. Hey, Dad. Do we have a gun?
What's that?
Do we have a gun?
Welcome back to Your Need to Know. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and today I am talking with Delegate Marcus Simon of the 53rd House District. When we went to break, Delegate Simon, you were talking about talking to fourth graders and about how you sat where they sat and you grew up to be a state legislator. So there's an opportunity for children to actually get involved at a very young age, and it's through the PAGE program, which I think a lot of people don't even know what that is.
Yeah, I was also saying earlier that I had my sort of awakening to the fact that of the state legislature in my 20s, but there's an opportunity to get kids involved earlier and really get them some hands-on exposure to the General Assembly. It's through the PAGE program. So we have, every year when we go down there's this troop of about 40 8th graders mostly, 7th, 8th, and 9th graders who put on their blue blazers and their tan pants, and we can hit a button and we can summon one of them. Sometimes I wish I had one of those at home. But,
right.
I miss it when I'm not in session. But those kids are picked through a pretty selective process, but anybody can apply. You just go online on the virginiageneralassembly.gov website, or you can Google Virginia PAGE program. And there's a House program and a Senate program. You've got to have pretty good academic credentials, and you've got to write an essay, and so be a good writer again, that explains what your qualifications are. You've got to come meet your local delegate and get a sponsor or senator to sponsor your application. And I love to sit with young 7th and 8th graders to talk about that part of the process and write an endorsement for them. And then they put in their application about October, and usually by the end of November, they know who they're going to be. I always tell my folks that apply for both. You double your chances if you apply for the House program and the Senate program. But I had a great young, very excited 8th grader come to me in September of 2018, and she got her application in, and she didn't get into the House program because we have 100 members sponsoring people.
Right.
So she got into the Senate, which has the same number of pages, but only 40 folks doing it. So Senator Saslaw got her into the Senate PAGE program, and she had the time of her life.
So my husband Tom's son, Matt, was also a PAGE, and they go down, they stay all together in a hotel. They're very well chaperoned. They have tutors there, so they're doing schoolwork during the week. They come home on the weekends, much like legislators do. So it's kind of the same process, but it's a lot of times it's these young people's first time away from home. It's not like camp because it's a job. Like
Right.
They have real responsibilities.
Well, and it's amazing to me always how much they absorb while they're down there. And it's not always clear because they're running errands, they're doing things, they're sometimes poking each other in the ribs with their elbows, but it's amazing how much they absorb, and you usually learn that they have a session near the end where the pages do their own debate, the PAGE debate, and they sponsor their own bills. And you listen to them, and you realize they've been listening to you, right? And they've heard what's going on, and they've really taken in a lot. We had one great discussion that we've yet to have in the real General Assembly, which is there was a bill to remove Harry Bird's statue from Capitol Square.
Yes.
And the kids were ready to go there, right?
Yeah,
the adults
me
haven't
too,
been ready
me
to get
too.
there yet, but the kids were. And so it's also amazing because of the numbers. Right now, the General Assembly is mostly Republican, and the Republicans that are there have much more seniority. So the pages are disproportionately from Republican areas, but you wouldn't know that from the bills they introduce at their mock session. They're much more progressive than their parents and grandparents.
Because it's a generational thing. So many things have to do with young people's experience in the world, and it's different. They come in with a tremendous lack of prejudice to begin with,
right,
before they get socialized to a worldview.
Well, we've also seen this happening. I mean, we're having a generational shift within the Democratic caucus, certainly in Richmond as well. In 2017, I alluded to this earlier, we had a big wave election, and we got 16 new members, and we have flipped 15 seats. And it's a much different, the folks that they replaced are much different than the folks that replaced them, right? So we had a record number of women come in. We had our first 2 Latina delegates elected to the House of Delegates. We've got our first transgender candidate. That's gotten a lot of press, but also our first lesbian woman, a number of firsts. And it's an incredibly diverse group of folks. We have a lot of folks, in their 30s and some in their 20s.
20s, I know.
We just had a special election to replace Jennifer Boysko, and it's a 29-year-old Muslim American Palestinian. So it's a completely different perspective than we've had before. And that's been watching the Republicans have to engage with them as colleagues and peers has been a great experience to see. And it's also been great for them to learn sort of that patience that you talk about. It's easy to come down sort of impatient to change the world, but you realize that there's a process. But it doesn't mean you can't push it, and it doesn't mean you shouldn't, because change doesn't happen without people agitating for it. And so it's been really great to see down there. And it helped us, like I said, get some signature accomplishments like Medicaid expansion, but it's also helped us in criminal justice reform, right? We're finding there are places where Republicans and Democrats at opposite ends of the spectrum agree on things like driver's license suspensions, right? This is one that beginning July 1st, people that had their driver's licenses suspended for failing to pay court fines and fees have had them reinstated now.
But
we've got
that's
to go,
temporary, right? For 1 year.
Well, yeah, so we've had to go tell them that they're, well, it's because it's only in the budget, right? When the
I
budget
know,
expires,
so it wasn't legislation.
they may not be there.
And that's the thing that people need to understand too. There's so many nuances about what you can put in a budget like this that is not legislation, which means that after that budget line item sunsets or whatever, you still have to go back and try to permanently put that as a law.
Well, so what's one of the most interesting things to watch people experience and is, when we had this big wave election, we took 15 seats, we get to 49, right? So 49-51. So you think, well, if I just get 2 people on my side, then I'll have to just change 2 of their minds and we'll pass the bill. But that's not how things work. One of the reasons the budget is different is because the budget, everybody has to vote on, right? You can't put the budget bill and stick it in a committee and then kill it, right?
Committee,
which is what happens to a lot of popular things like the ERA, for instance, this year.
Yes.
We had 52 co-sponsors, but it was assigned to a subcommittee where it was with instructions to the subcommittee chairman to kill it. Same thing happens with LGBT equality bills like housing equality and non-job discrimination. Even though they're very popular issues, the Republican leadership puts them in committees for the purpose of killing them.
So let's just pause it here and not assume that people understand that the party in power elects the speaker in their party, and that speaker assigns membership to committees.
Every committee, and even the minority members, right? So even Democrats, I don't get to pick my committees. My leader doesn't get, Eileen Fillicorn doesn't decide what committees I'm on. The Republican speaker decides. And so
it's always weighted more of the majority party, in this case Republicans, always weighted more, so their vote will always carry.
Right, and even if you have relatively close numbers, it's a little bit about who, right? So on militia, police, and public safety, where all of our gun bills go, that's entirely made up of rural legislators, where them being anti-gun control or super pro-gun is an advantage for them. So when they vote to kill universal background checks, even though across the state it's incredibly popular in their districts, they're among their Republican primary voters, that's a good vote for them. So he's able to stack the committees that way. So those things that do get to the floor, though, like budget and budget amendments, that's how we got driver's licenses done, because it didn't go to a courts committee where one very conservative delegate can kill it by just either not putting it on the agenda or not letting us vote on it.
So let's talk about one of the bills that you passed, where I saw in the newspaper, and this always makes me feel good. You see in the newspaper that somebody was convicted under the revenge porn law, and he was found guilty and fined. And I'm thinking, I know who sponsored that bill, and that was you.
Yeah, so I mean that's one of those, the Schoolhouse Rock kind of moments, right? Where when I was running for office in 2013, all of a sudden. It's like when you get a new car, all of a sudden you see all the other cars, right? So I'm running for office, I'm hearing what other legislators are doing in legislatures. And there's this issue of revenge pornography is a fairly new phenomenon. And other states were there had been 3 states at the time trying to criminalize that. I'm like, well, somebody ought to do that in Virginia. And so on the campaign trail, I started talking about, well, if I'm elected, I'll try and address this issue. Well, it turns out that there was someone who'd been a victim of this out in Fredericksburg, and she went to the state police, who said there's nothing we can do about it. It's not a crime. And she's like, well, who do I complain to? They're like, well, you can complain to your member of the House of Delegates. And they'd heard about what I was up to. They said, you should talk to this newly elected Delegate Simon. And so we put in the bill. She came and testified. So this is, talking about getting involved. This is one person reaching out to somebody who she heard, not her delegate, but somebody who's interested in the issue. She came down, she testified, and that bill became the law. It says that it's illegal to take, even if you've legally obtained them, but pictures of somebody that are in a state of undress and to disseminate them without their permission for the purpose of intimidating, harassing, coercing, and causing them emotional harm is a crime in Virginia. And somebody was, like you said, somebody actually did that. They actually sent it to a member of the state legislature,
which is about as stupid as it gets.
Right?
Seriously.
And it was a picture of one of their staffers, and so yeah, they went straight to the Capitol Police and went to the state police, and that person was recently found guilty and fined for this conduct. But it's also something you can stay on top of. So that one of the reasons we go down every year is because things change and technology changes, and we try and keep up with it. And this was a new phenomenon in 2013, and it's evolved. And so in December of this year, and here's one for a tip, I guess, before we get to this. Connect with your legislators, find out who they are, but also connect with them on social media. Right. Find out what almost all of us have a Twitter account, we have a Facebook page. Some of us have YouTube accounts, and it's a great way to sort of it's the new public square, right? So
Right.
it's a great way to publicly say to somebody, hey, here's a problem, what are you doing about it, right? So there was a story in the Post in December about something called deep fake pornography, where people were no longer did you have to have somebody make the arguably poor decision, right, to share a picture of themselves in a state of undress. You could just find anybody undressed and a picture of my face, and you could graft it together to create synthetic pornography and then distribute that, again, for the same purposes, right? To harass, to intimidate, to blackmail in some cases, to cost somebody their job. There are all kinds of reasons that people were doing this, most of which were harmful. And there was no recourse now because under the old revenge porn law, it had to be a picture of me.
Actual picture of
Right.
you.
And so we didn't have language to address these synthetic kinds of pornography. So somebody said, brought that to my attention. We introduced a bill in December, introduced a bill in January, and we went through the committee process of amending it and talked with lawyers and defense lawyers and prosecutors, say what language do we need to have to actually make this work. Went back and forth between the House and the Senate, ended up in a conference committee, but at the end of the session, we had a bill that passed, and that became law again. Virginia became the first state to actually outlaw deep fake, what they call deep fake revenge pornography, on July 1st of this year.
And see, and this is what I think is so amazing, is that a person, a problem, an instance becomes a law, but there's a process for it. And here in the last few minutes of our show, I want to remind people that this summer there are going to be forums, there's going to be debates, there's going to be town halls. And by following your Twitter account, your Facebook page, people will know where to find you in person if they want to find you in person. And if people have an idea, they need to be thinking about their idea now, because in September and in the fall, you start putting together language for bills.
Yeah, well, they need to participate, right? I mean, they really need to start to participate, one, in this election process. That's very important. The timing of, again, if you have a great idea for a piece of legislation that you've wondered why it's not the law already, my dad knows how to find me, but it was, yeah, he was walking down the street, couldn't understand why there was so much litter, right? So he has an idea for how we can reduce litter, which I'll get into another story. But if you have an idea like that, now is the time to get it to us, because legislative services, the bills have to be drafted, right? So it's a good idea. We got to figure out what section of the code and so forth. So we have a staff of attorneys that will draft those for us. And then we got to reach out to those interest groups that are affected, let everybody get their input. Because if we get to January and it's not been vetted yet, and then we're putting it in for the first time, unless it's something simple, the first reaction is it's not ready. And the response to it's not ready is, we'll kill it this year, try again next year. So the time to start to get your drafting done is now. Let's get it out to anybody who you think might be opposed to it, let them weigh in now and try and get to what we call peace in the valley, right? Because consensus, so that when it comes in January, it's pretty close to ready to go. So all we're really doing is wordsmithing by the time we get there to Richmond.
Well, thank you so much. This has been fantastic advice, Delegate Simon. And for those at home, this is what you need to know.